The morning of March 4th, 1944, dawned cold and clear over Debden Airfield, 40 miles north of London. Colonel Donald Blakesley stood on the tarmac, watching as 63 brand-new P-51B Mustangs received their final pre-flight checks. His fighter group, the 4th, had just converted from P-47 Thunderbolts 2 days earlier. Most of his pilots had less than an hour of checkout time in these sleek new machines. Today, they would escort 800 B 17 seconds and B 24 seconds to Berlin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission briefing had been tense. Berlin sat 470 miles from Debden. The P-51's official maximum speed was 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, running on standard 100-octane fuel at 67 inches of manifold pressure. Fast enough to catch most German fighters, fast enough to escort bombers deep into Reich airspace. But every pilot in that briefing room understood the same brutal mathematics. Speed wasn't just about catching the enemy, it was about surviving long enough to make it home. Captain James Goodson of the 336th Squadron had done the calculations in his ready room the night before. A Focke-Wulf 190 could hit 426 miles per hour in level flight. A Messerschmitt 109G could manage 398. The P-51B's advantage was marginal, sometimes just 10 or 15 miles per hour. In a dogfight over Berlin, that margin meant the difference between breaking off safely and becoming another statistic in the Luftwaffe's kill sheets. But there was something else bothering the pilots that morning, something nobody wanted to say out loud in the briefing. The Germans had introduced a new variant of the Focke-Wulf, the 190 D-9, codenamed Dora 9 by Allied intelligence. Reports from reconnaissance flights suggested it could hit 440 miles per hour, maybe faster. If those reports were accurate, American fighters would be flying into German airspace in aircraft that were technically slower than what they'd be facing. Blakesley gathered his squadron commanders near the operations tent before takeoff. His words were characteristically blunt. "We're taking these planes to Berlin with 2 days of training and reports saying the Germans have fighters faster than ours. Anybody want to back out?" Nobody moved. Blakesley nodded. "Good. Let's go kill some Nazis." The formation took off at 0900 hours, climbing through scattered clouds into brilliant sunshine. The Mustangs carried external drop tanks, 108 gallons slung under each wing, extending their range but creating drag that cut their top speed by nearly 15 miles per hour. They'd drop those tanks before engaging in combat, but until then, every P-51 inches the formation was flying heavy and slow. 2 hours into the mission, approaching the German border, Goodson was running through the standard power settings in his mind. Military power, the continuous rating, gave him about 1,490 horsepower at 61 inches of mercury manifold pressure. War emergency power, reserved for combat, pushed that to 67 inches and around 1,670 horsepower for 5 minutes maximum before engine damage became likely. He'd trained on these settings at altitude back in the States. They were gospel, written into every technical manual. What Goodson didn't know that morning was that those power settings, those sacred specifications that defined what his aircraft could and couldn't do, were based on assumptions that were about to become obsolete. And the man who would prove those assumptions wrong wasn't flying a fighter over Germany. He was sitting in a laboratory in New Jersey, running calculations about fuel, chemistry that would eventually rewrite the performance limits of every Mustang in the European theatre. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Hooker, though most people called him Hives because of his connection to the Rolls-Royce engineering team that had revolutionized the Merlin engine's Supercharger design. But Hooker's real contribution wouldn't come from Britain. It would come from an American chemist named Thomas Midgley, who'd already been dead for 2 months when Blakesley's formation crossed into German airspace. Midgley had spent his career working with tetraethyllead, the additive that raised octane ratings in gasoline. By 1942, he'd perfected a formulation that would eventually become known as 100/150 grade aviation fuel. It contained 4.6 cubic centimeters of tetraethyl lead per gallon, compared to 3 cubic centimeters in standard 100 octane. That extra lead dramatically increased detonation resistance, allowing engines to run at higher boost pressures without destroying themselves. But in March of 1944, that fuel wasn't yet in widespread use. It was still being tested, still being evaluated by engineers who couldn't quite believe it would work without catastrophic engine failures. The entire 8th Air Force was flying on 100 octane, operating at conservative power settings that kept engines safe but left performance on the table. Over Brandenburg, 60 miles from Berlin, the German fighters appeared. Goodson saw them first, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190 Dorus at 30,000 feet, diving hard toward the bomber stream. He called them out over the radio and pushed his throttle forward to war emergency power. The Packard Merlin V1650 engine responded immediately, manifold pressure climbing to 67 inches, cylinder head temperatures rising toward 230 degrees Celsius. His airspeed indicator crept past 400 miles per hour. As he dropped his external tanks and rolled inverted to meet the German fighters, what happened next would later be described in Goodson's after-action report as textbook fighter engagement. He got on the tail of a 190, fired a 2-second burst that shredded its left wing, and watched it spiral toward the ground, trailing smoke and glycol. But what the report didn't mention, what Goodson couldn't articulate in official language, was the sick feeling in his gut when he realized the Focke-Wulf had been pulling away from him before he landed those hits. The German pilot had made a mistake, had pulled up instead of continuing his dive. That mistake had cost him his life. Goodson's Mustang hadn't been fast enough to catch him on speed alone. 14 fighters were lost that day. The mission was called Black Monday, and the bomber casualties were catastrophic. 69 heavy bombers failed to return, another 701 crew members dead or missing. The Luftwaffe had put up fierce resistance, and the American fighters, for all their range and maneuverability, had been stretched to their operational limits. That evening, in the debriefing room at Debden, Captain Goodson sat with his flight recorder and tried to describe what he'd seen. "The Dora 9 pulled away from me at 28,000 feet, he said. "I was at war, emergency power, full throttle, and it still gained distance." The intelligence officer taking notes looked uncomfortable. "The performance data we have says the 190D tops out at 440. You were flying 437. The margin's tight, but you should have been able to stay with him." Goodson shook his head. "I'm telling you what I saw. If we're going back to Berlin, we need more speed." The question hung in the air, unanswered, because nobody in that room knew how to make a Mustang faster than Packard and North American Aviation had already made it. The engine was running at its maximum certified boost pressure. The airframe was already optimized for speed with its laminar flow wing. You couldn't just ask the airplane for more speed. That wasn't how engineering worked. But 300 miles away, at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, a different conversation was taking place. Major Thomas Hall of the Army Air Force's Material Command had just received preliminary test data from a series of engine runs using 150-grade fuel at boost pressures that would have horrified peacetime engine designers. The data showed that the Packard Merlin could handle 72 inches of mercury manifold pressure, maybe as high as 75 inches, without detonation or mechanical failure. That represented roughly 10% more power than war emergency rating. 10% more power meant 10% more speed, maybe more if you factored in propeller efficiency and reduced drag coefficients at higher velocities. Hall had forwarded the data to his superiors with a recommendation that field trials begin immediately. He'd also added a note that would prove prophetic. If we can push these engines harder without breaking them, we're not just making our fighters faster, we're changing the tactical equation over Germany. The Germans have been improving their fighters continuously. We need to do the same, and we need to do it now, before we lose more bombers because our escorts can't keep up. The response came back marked priority. Test program approved. Coordinate with 5th Air Force Service Command for field implementation. Timeline: immediate. That message was dated March 7, 1944, 3 days after Black Monday. By the time it reached the 8th Air Force headquarters in England, decisions were already being made that would bypass normal procurement channels, skip standard safety protocols, and put American pilots in aircraft running engine settings that officially didn't exist. Because sometimes, in war, you don't wait for permission. You do what needs to be done and apologize later. If you survive long enough to apologize. Technical Sergeant Michael Harrington didn't look like someone who was about to change the European air war. He was 31 years old, balding slightly, with permanent grease stains under his fingernails and a service record that showed competence rather than brilliance. He'd been a civilian mechanic before the war, working on farm equipment in Iowa. The Army had trained him on aircraft engines, assigned him to the 8th Air Force, and shipped him to England in late 1943. By March of 1944, he was the senior engine specialist for the 357th Fighter Group based at Leiston, about 90 miles northeast of London. His job was to keep 60 Mustangs flying, which meant 16-hour days, constant parts shortages, and an endless battle against moisture, cold, and metal fatigue. On March 15th, Harrington received a classified technical directive from 8th Air Force, Service Command. The document was stamped, experimental, and required his signature, acknowledging that he understood the contents were not to be discussed outside official channels. He signed, figuring it was another bureaucratic requirement, then opened the folder and read for 10 minutes straight without looking up. The directive authorized field testing of increased boost pressure settings on selected P-51B and P-51D aircraft. Standard war emergency power was 67 inches of mercury. The new authorization went to 75 inches using 150 grade aviation fuel, which was being shipped to forward airfields beginning immediately. The directive included detailed instructions for engine monitoring, mandatory temperature checks after each flight, and a list of potential failure modes that made Harrington's hands sweat just reading them. Piston seizure, exhaust valve failure, connecting rod breakage, catastrophic detonation with cylinder head separation. These were the things that happened when you pushed engines past their design limits. These were the reasons that engineers built in safety margins and wrote technical manuals telling you exactly how far you could go and no further. The directive included a handwritten note clipped to the last page. Sergeant Harrington, your group has been selected for initial field trials due to your experience and your commander's assessment of pilot skill levels. We understand the risks. Proceed with maximum caution but maximum speed. Lives depend on this working. The signature was illegible, but the rank insignia was clear. Lieutenant Colonel, Army Air Forces Material Command. Harrington walked to the maintenance tent, where his crew was overhauling a Merlin engine pulled from a P-51 that had ingested a bird on takeoff. He gathered them around a workbench and spread out the directive. Listen carefully, he said. We're about to run these engines harder than they've ever been run. We're talking about 200 extra horsepower, maybe more. That's the good news. One of the younger mechanics, a corporal from Texas named Ramirez, asked the obvious question. What's the bad news? Harrington looked at the engine on the stand, its cylinders exposed, its pistons gleaming with fresh oil. The bad news is that we're going to find out which parts fail first. And we're going to find out with pilots in the air, over Germany, with no place to land if something breaks. The first shipment of 150 grade fuel arrived at Leiston on March 20th. It came in standard 55-gallon drums, marked with yellow stripes and a stenciled warning, 100/150 grade, authorized use only, extreme fire hazard. The fuel looked identical to standard 100 octane. It smelled the same. The only difference was molecular, invisible, a slightly higher concentration of tetraethyl lead that would allow combustion chambers to withstand pressures that would normally blow engines apart. Harrington selected 6 aircraft for the initial test program. He chose P-51Ds that had relatively low flight hours, engines that hadn't been stressed by prolonged combat operations. Each aircraft received a complete engine inspection, new spark plugs, careful calibration of the fuel-air mixture controls, and a modification to the boost pressure regulator that allowed the pilot to manually override the automatic limit and push the throttle to 75 inches of mercury. The modification was simple, mechanically. A small adjustment to the aneroid capsule that sensed manifold pressure and cut off boost at 67 inches. By slightly bending the capsule's actuating arm, Harrington created clearance for an additional 8 inches of boost. It took 15 minutes per aircraft. It was also completely unauthorized by Packard or North American Aviation, and if anyone from those companies had seen what he was doing, they would have pulled his certification and possibly pressed charges. But Harrington had read the technical directive 3 times. He'd studied the test data from right field, and he'd watched 4 of his pilots get shot down in the past 2 weeks, 3 of them during running fights where German fighters had simply outrun damaged Mustangs trying to disengage. If bending a piece of metal in an engine compartment could bring those pilots home alive, he'd bend every piece of metal on the airfield. The first test flight was scheduled for March 22nd. Colonel James Howard, the 357th Fighter Group commander, had personally volunteered to fly it. Howard was a Medal of Honor recipient, a pilot with 14 confirmed kills, and a reputation for aggressive tactics. He was also someone who understood risk assessment. If Harrington's modification was going to fail catastrophically, better it happened with an experienced pilot who might be able to recover the aircraft. At 0700 hours, Howard walked, around P-51D serial, number 4413785, performing his pre-flight inspection. The aircraft looked completely standard. The only visible difference was a small red triangle painted on the engine cowling, about 3 inches across. Harrington had added it as a warning marker. Any crew chief who saw that triangle would know this aircraft was running non-standard engine settings. Howard climbed into the cockpit and ran through his startup checklist. Engine instruments normal. Oil pressure 75 psi. Coolant temperature 85 degrees Celsius. Everything exactly as it should be. He advanced the throttle and felt the Merlin respond. 1,240 cylinders firing in perfect synchronization. Propeller biting into cold morning air. Tower cleared him for takeoff at 0720. Howard released the brakes and pushed the throttle to 40 inches of mercury. Standard takeoff power. The Mustang accelerated smoothly, tail coming up at 50 miles per hour, wheels leaving the runway at 95. He cleaned up the landing gear and flaps, then pointed the nose east toward the North Sea and began his climb. At 10,000 feet, Howard leveled off and began his test profile. First, he'd establish a baseline with standard power settings. Then, gradually, he'd increase boost pressure beyond normal limits and monitor engine response. Harrington had installed additional cylinder head temperature gauges in the cockpit, giving Howard readouts for all 12 cylinders instead of just the standard average reading. If any cylinder started running hot, he'd see it immediately. Military power at 61 inches gave him 405 miles per hour indicated at 10,000 feet, exactly what the book said. He enriched the mixture slightly, watching fuel flow increase from 85 gallons per hour to 92. Cylinder head temperatures held steady at 210 degrees Celsius, everything normal. Then Howard reached for the boost override lever that Harrington had installed next to the throttle. It was a simple mechanical linkage, painted red, with a safety wire that had to be broken before the lever could be moved. He snapped the wire, took a breath, and began advancing the throttle past its normal stop. Manifold pressure climbed past 67 inches, 68, 69, 70. Howard felt the airframe shudder slightly as the propeller absorbed additional power. His airspeed indicator began moving faster. 410 miles per hour, 415. The Merlin's note changed, deepening to a sustained roar that vibrated through the control stick. 72 inches of mercury, 423 miles per hour, indicated. Cylinder head temperatures climbing now, 220 degrees, 225, still within acceptable limits but getting close to the red line. Howard held the power setting for 30 seconds, his eyes scanning the engine instruments in a continuous pattern. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature 105 degrees, higher than normal but not critical. No unusual vibrations. No smoke or vapor trails from the engine cowling. He pushed further. 75 inches. The aircraft seemed to leap forward, acceleration pressing him back into his seat with force he'd never felt from a Mustang before. 432 miles per hour. 435. 438. The airspeed indicator hesitated, then jumped to 441. 441 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. That was 4 miles per hour faster than the Mustang's rated maximum speed at 25,000 feet with standard power. And Howard was doing it at 1/3 the altitude, in thick air that should have limited his top speed to around 410. The 150 grade fuel and 75 inches of boost had given him 30 miles per hour of additional performance, maybe more once he climbed to optimal altitude. Howard held the power setting for 2 minutes, monitoring every gauge, waiting for something to break. Nothing did. The Merlin ran rough, the vibration more pronounced than at standard settings, but it ran. After 2 minutes, he pulled the throttle back to military power and began a slow descent back to Leiston. He landed at 08:15 and taxied to the maintenance area where Harrington and his crew were waiting. Howard shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit without saying anything. He walked around to the engine, cowling, placed his hand on the metal, and held it there for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Harrington and smiled. "It's hot as hell, and it sounds like it wants to shake itself apart. But it worked. I hit 441, indicated at 10,000 feet. Harrington felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. 441. That's 30 overbook. Howard nodded. Which means, at altitude, with proper technique, we might see 460, maybe 470. We just made every Mustang in England faster than a Focke-Wulf Dora. Now we need to prove it doesn't blow up after 50 hours. The engine came off the aircraft that afternoon. Harrington and his crew tore it down completely, inspecting every component for stress damage, unusual wear patterns, or metallurgical changes that might indicate impending failure. They measured cylinder bore tolerances, examined piston ring sealing surfaces, checked connecting rod bearing clearances, and photographed every spark plug to document combustion patterns. What they found surprised them. The engine was remarkably clean. Cylinder head deposits were actually lower than expected, suggesting that the higher combustion temperatures were burning more fuel completely, rather than leaving carbon buildup. The exhaust valves showed slight discoloration from heat, but no erosion or deformation. Piston crowns had minor scorching marks, but no melted aluminum or other signs of detonation. Harrington compiled a detailed report that night and sent it to 8th Air Force Service Command with a single-line conclusion. Engine inspection shows no significant wear after 2-minute high-boost run. Recommend expanded testing. The response came back within hours. Proceed. Install high-boost capability on all available aircraft. Pilot briefings begin immediately. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April 1st, 1944, 43P, 51 seconds in the 357th Fighter Group had been modified for high-boost operation. Similar modifications were underway at other fighter groups across England, coordinated through a network of maintenance sergeants who'd received the same classified directive that Harrington had opened 2 weeks earlier. The program was moving fast, perhaps too fast for normal safety protocols, but nobody was arguing for caution. Not after the losses of March. Not with bomber crews dying because fighter escorts couldn't maintain station against German aircraft that were getting faster with each new variant. Speed had become more than a tactical advantage. It had become survival. The pilots received their briefings in small groups, away from normal intelligence sessions. Colonel Howard personally conducted most of them, explaining the technical details in language that focused on capabilities rather than risks. You have an additional 8 inches of boost available using the red override lever, he told them. That translates to roughly 200 extra horsepower and 25 to 30 miles per hour additional speed at combat altitudes. One pilot, a lieutenant named Robert Jackson, asked the question everyone was thinking. What about engine life? How long can we run at 75 inches before something breaks? Howard's answer was honest. We don't know yet. Wright Field estimates 50 to 100 hours at high boost before you start seeing component failures. But that's laboratory data. Combat conditions might be different. The rule is simple. Use high boost when you need it. When you're chasing a bogey, when you're disengaging from a fight, when you absolutely need that extra speed. Don't cruise at 75 inches. Don't use it for showing off. Use it to stay alive. Jackson nodded slowly. So we're test pilots now. Howard smiled without humor. Son, you've been a test pilot since the day you flew your first combat mission. The only difference is now you know it. The first combat use of high boost power settings occurred on April 8, 1944, during a bomber escort mission to Brunswick. Captain Arthur Jeffrey of the 362nd Fighter Squadron was flying top cover at 30,000 feet when he spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 109Gs positioning for a high-side attack on the bomber stream. Jeffrey called them out and rolled inverted to intercept, pushing his throttle to war emergency power. The 109s saw him coming and dove away, standard Luftwaffe tactic. Draw the escort fighters down, bleed their energy, then reverse, and engage when they were slow and vulnerable. Jeffrey stayed with them, airspeed building through 420 miles per hour, 430, 440. The Messerschmitts were pulling away, their superior dive performance opening the gap. Jeffrey reached for the red override lever and broke the safety wire. He advanced the throttle to 75 inches and felt the Mustang surge forward. His indicated airspeed climbed past 460 miles per hour. The 109s stopped pulling away. Jeffrey closed the distance, got one in his gun sight, and fired a 3-second burst that tore the German fighter's tail off. He pulled out of the dive at 12,000 feet, breathing hard, and checked his engine instruments. Cylinder head temperatures were pegged at 235 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees over the red line. But the engine was still running smoothly. He throttled back to military power and climbed back to altitude, rejoining his flight. That evening, Jeffrey filed his after-action report. Target destroyed with extended high-boost dive from 3 to 0,000 feet. Aircraft performance exceeded expectations. No mechanical difficulties. Engine temps high but stable. His group commander read the report, initialed it, and forwarded it to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a notation. High boost modification, proving effective in combat. Request authorization for fleet-wide implementation. That authorization came through on April 12th. All P-51 units in the European Theatre of Operations were to receive the boost pressure modification as quickly as maintenance crews could perform the work. The 150-grade fuel was being shipped in bulk, enough to supply every fighter base in England. By May, the 8th Air Force expected to have over 600 Mustangs capable of high-boost operation, but the program wasn't without problems. On April 15th, a P-51D from the 356th Fighter Group suffered a catastrophic engine failure during a training flight. The pilot, Lieutenant Carl Morrison, was running high-boost power at 28,000 feet when he heard a sharp metallic crack from the engine compartment. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Coolant temperature spiked past 140 degrees. Morrison shut down the engine immediately and glided 20 miles back to his base, landing dead stick on a grass field adjacent to the runway. The engine inspection revealed that a connecting rod bearing had failed, allowing the rod to separate and punch a hole through the side of the crankcase. Investigators from Wright Field spent 3 days examining the wreckage, trying to determine whether high-boost operation had caused the failure or whether it was a metallurgical defect that would have failed eventually, regardless of power settings. Their conclusion was inconclusive. The bearing showed signs of oil starvation, possibly from a blocked oil passage, possibly from inadequate oil pressure at extreme boost levels. Additional inspection protocols were issued to all fighter groups, requiring oil system pressure checks before and after any flight using high-boost power. 3 more engine failures occurred over the next 2 weeks, all involving similar bearing problems. Sergeant Harrington reviewed each failure report, looking for patterns. The failures were occurring in engines with more than 200 flight hours, suggesting that cumulative wear was making older engines more vulnerable to high boost stresses. He issued a recommendation. Any engine with over 150 hours should be restricted to standard boost settings until overhaul. Fresh engines only for high boost operations. The recommendation was adopted immediately. Engine change rates increased as maintenance crews pulled older Merlins and replaced them with newly overhauled units shipped from depot-level facilities. The cost in man-hours was enormous. The cost in lost operational aircraft waiting for engine changes was measurable, but the alternative was pilots dying because their engines quit over Germany. By late April, the modification program had reached a kind of equilibrium. Roughly 400 P-51 seconds were cleared for high-boost operation. Another 200 were restricted to standard power pending engine replacement. Pilots were learning to use the additional power judiciously, treating it like a reserve weapon to be deployed only when necessary. And the tactical results were becoming undeniable. German fighter pilots started reporting that American Mustangs were faster than intelligence assessments had indicated. Luftwaffe combat doctrine began changing, with orders to avoid prolonged tail chases against P-51 seconds, because the Americans could now maintain pursuit speeds that German fighters couldn't match. Bomber losses continued, but fighter versus fighter engagements were tilting in favor of the Americans. On May 8, 1944, the 357th Fighter Group flew a maximum effort mission to Berlin, escorting over 700 heavy bombers in the largest daylight raid yet mounted against the German capital. The Luftwaffe response was massive. Over 300 German fighters engaged the formation, and the air battle lasted nearly 40 minutes. In that battle, pilots using high-boost power settings achieved a kill ratio of 8-1 against German fighters. Not because they were better trained or more skilled, though many were, but because they could dictate the terms of engagement. They could chase down targets that tried to disengage. They could break off attacks when outnumbered, accelerating away faster than pursuing Germans could follow. Speed had always mattered in fighter combat. Now the Americans had more of it. Captain Jeffrey, who'd scored the first high-boost kill in April, added 3 more victories on the Berlin mission. In his after-action report, he wrote something that would later be quoted in histories of the air war. "We used to worry about German fighters being too fast for us. Now they worry about us being too fast for them. That's not just a technical advantage. That's psychological warfare. When the enemy knows he can't catch you, he stops trying." But the real proof of the program's success wouldn't come from kill ratios or after-action reports. It would come from something more fundamental. In March of 1944, before high-boost modifications began, the 8th Air Force lost 97 P-51 seconds in combat. In May, after most fighter groups had been upgraded, losses dropped to 53 aircraft. Bomber losses fell, even more dramatically, from nearly 600 aircraft in March to 283 in May. Some of that reduction came from declining Luftwaffe strength. German pilot quality was degrading as experienced aviators were killed and replaced by inadequately trained recruits. But the numbers told a clear story. Faster fighters meant better bomber protection. Better protection meant fewer losses. Fewer losses meant more bombs on target. More bombs on target meant a shorter war. On June 1, 1944, Technical Sergeant Michael Harrington received orders transferring him to Wright Field for temporary duty. He was to assist in formalizing the high-boost modification program, writing official technical orders that would replace the classified directives that had started everything. He was being pulled off the front lines because his field experience was needed to teach others what he'd learned through trial and error. Before he left Leiston, Harrington walked through the maintenance area one last time, looking at the P-51 seconds that his crew had modified. 60 aircraft now, all bearing the small red triangle on their cowlings. He thought about Lieutenant Morrison, who'd dead-sticked his aircraft back to base after a bearing failure. He thought about the 437 pilots who were flying these modified aircraft into combat every day, trusting that the engines wouldn't quit, that the modifications would hold, that someone had done the math correctly. Harrington had done the math. He'd also done something more important. He'd been willing to act on that math, even when official channels said to wait for approval, even when engineers with better credentials questioned his judgment. Sometimes being right wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to be right and brave enough to prove it. The story should end there, with American fighters dominating German skies, with high-boost modifications becoming standard equipment, with Sergeant Harrington receiving recognition for his contribution. But that's not quite what happened, because the title of this story mentions 487 miles per hour, and we haven't gotten there yet. And the reason we haven't gotten there is more complicated than engine modifications or fuel chemistry. It's about the difference between what's technically possible and what's operationally practical. It's about the gap between laboratory performance and combat reality. And it's about a variant of the Mustang that would eventually reach that mythical 487 mile per hour number, but not in the way anyone expected, and not over Berlin. The P-51H Mustang first flew on February 3, 1945. It was a lightweight variant, shedding 700 pounds through a redesigned airframe, thinner skin panels, and a smaller fuselage fuel tank. North American Aviation had built it specifically to achieve maximum speed, equipping it with a Packard V1659 engine capable of 2,270 horsepower with water injection. In test flights at Wright Field, the P-51H achieved 487 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It was the fastest production Mustang ever built, 50 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. It was also the variant that never saw combat over Berlin or anywhere else in Europe. The first production P-51Hs didn't reach operational units until July of 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered. 555 were built before production ended, and not one of them fired a shot in anger over Germany. The aircraft that the title of this story references, the Mustang that could genuinely hit 487, arrived too late to matter. So what really happened over Berlin? What was the actual top speed of the P-51 seconds that fought their way to the German capital and back? The aircraft that Sergeant Harrington modified. That Captain Jeffrey flew, that Colonel Howard tested? The answer is both simpler and more complex than the mythology suggests. With 150 grade fuel and 75 inches of boost, a P-51D could achieve approximately 460 miles per hour at optimal altitude. Not 487, not even 470, 460, maybe 465, in perfect conditions with a light fuel load and a well-maintained engine. That 20-mile-per-hour gain over standard configuration doesn't sound revolutionary, but in context, it was transformative. It meant American fighters could catch Focke-Wulf D-9s that previously would have escaped. It meant pilots could disengage from bad situations by simply accelerating away. It meant the psychological advantage shifted decisively toward the Allies. But here's what the performance charts and after-action reports don't tell you. The high-boost modification program was never officially sanctioned by North American Aviation or Packard. It was a field expedient, authorized by mid-level officers at Wright Field who were willing to bypass normal engineering review because combat losses demanded immediate action. When Packard engineers finally inspected several high-boost aircraft in June of 1944, their report was scathing. The modifications exceeded engine design limits. The increased cylinder pressures were causing accelerated wear on piston rings and valve seats. The higher combustion temperatures were degrading spark plug electrodes faster than normal replacement schedules could handle. Expected engine life was reduced from 400 hours to approximately 250 hours. The recommendation was to immediately cease high-boost operations and return all aircraft to standard power settings. That recommendation was filed and ignored, because by June, high-boost Mustangs had already proven themselves in combat. Pilots were coming home who wouldn't have survived without that extra speed. Bomber crews were completing missions that would have failed without faster escorts. The cost in reduced engine life was deemed acceptable. Technical Sergeant Harrington spent 3 weeks at Wright Field that summer, defending his field modifications against engineers who had doctorate degrees and 20 years of experience. The conversations were tense. One senior engineer told him directly that he'd violated every principle of conservative engineering design, that he'd put pilots at risk with modifications that hadn't undergone proper testing, that he was lucky nobody had died from engine failures he'd caused. Harrington's response was simple. How many pilots died in March because we didn't have fast enough fighters? How many bomber crews didn't come home because we followed the rules? The engineer didn't have an answer for that. By August, the Army Air Forces had formalized what Harrington had started. Technical Order T-00160JJ2 authorized operation of P-51 aircraft with V-1657 engines at up to 75 inches of mercury manifold pressure using 100/150 grade fuel. The order included mandatory inspection intervals, specific oil pressure requirements, and detailed procedures for monitoring engine condition. It transformed an unofficial field modification into official doctrine. But the order also included something else, a footnote, easy to miss, that acknowledged the modification reduced expected engine life by approximately 38%. Pilots were to be informed of this reduction and were to use high boost power only when tactically necessary. In practice, that caveat was ignored. Pilots used high boost whenever they needed speed, which in combat was most of the time. The cost in maintenance hours was staggering. Engine change rates tripled. Depot-level facilities worked around the clock to overhaul Merlin engines, replacing worn components, remachining cylinders, refurbishing supercharger impellers. The logistics burden was enormous. But the alternative was accepting that German fighters could outrun American escorts, and that was no longer acceptable to anyone who'd seen bomber formations torn apart by fighters that pilots couldn't catch. In September of 1944, a P-51D from the 355th Fighter Group, flying a mission to Ludwigshafen, ran 75-inch boost continuously for 18 minutes during an extended running fight with multiple German fighters. The pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Moore, shot down 2 Messerschmitt 109Ks and damaged a third before disengaging. When he landed back at Steeple Morden, his engine was streaming coolant from a cracked cylinder head. Post-flight inspection revealed that 3 pistons had begun to melt, connecting rod bearings were failing, and the supercharger impeller had stress cracks. The engine was written off as unrepairable. But Moore had survived, and his wingman had survived, and they'd prevented German fighters from reaching a formation of B-17 seconds carrying 3,600 men. Against that arithmetic, one destroyed engine didn't matter. Packard was producing Merlin engines at a rate of 3,000 per month. Trained fighter pilots took a year to produce and couldn't be replaced anywhere near that fast. This was the hidden calculus of the high-boost program. It was trading metal for lives, engine hours for pilot survival, maintenance burden for tactical advantage. Nobody talked about it explicitly because the trade-off was uncomfortable. But everyone understood it. By April of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, over 2,000 P-51 seconds had been modified for high-boost operation. The program had become so routine that new pilots arriving in theatre received briefings on high-boost technique as part of their standard combat checkout. It was no longer experimental. It was simply how Mustangs fought. And then Germany surrendered, and suddenly the question became whether the modifications were worth continuing. The Pacific Theater had different tactical requirements. Japanese fighters generally weren't as fast as German aircraft, and the long over-water missions required maximum engine reliability rather than maximum speed. Some P-51 units deploying to the Pacific had their boost limiters reset to standard settings, sacrificing speed for reliability. Others kept the high boost capability, reasoning that even if it wasn't used routinely, having the option available was valuable. The debate continued through the summer of 1945, becoming moot when atomic bombs ended the war in August. Technical Sergeant Harrington returned to Iowa in November of 1945. He went back to fixing farm equipment, rarely mentioning his wartime service except when other veterans asked what he'd done. "A mechanic," he'd say. "I kept planes flying. which was true, as far as it went, but left out the part where he'd modified engines, in ways that weren't approved, taken risks that could have ended careers, and helped make American fighters fast enough to dominate German skies. He never received a medal for it. The Army didn't give decorations for bending, actuating arms and adjusting boost regulators. His name doesn't appear in most histories of the P-51 Mustang. The official story credits the 150-grade fuel program to right field engineers and high-level procurement decisions, which is accurate but incomplete. The P-51H, the variant that could genuinely hit 487 miles per hour, did eventually see limited service in the Korean War. By then it was obsolete, outclassed by jets, relegated to ground attack missions, where its speed advantage over propeller-driven opposition didn't matter because there was no propeller-driven opposition left. But the legacy of the high-boost program lived on in unexpected ways. The maintenance procedures developed for monitoring high-stress engines became standard practice throughout military aviation. The willingness to accept reduced component life in exchange for increased performance influenced jet engine design in the 1950s. And the principle that tactical necessity sometimes requires exceeding engineering limitations became doctrine in how the Air Force approached combat modifications. So did P-51 seconds ever hit 487 miles per hour over Berlin? No. The P-51H that could reach that speed never flew combat missions over Germany. The P-51Ds that did fight over Berlin topped out around 460 miles per hour with high-boost modifications. And that speed came at a cost in engine life that would have horrified peacetime engineers. But 460 was enough. It was enough to catch German fighters that were trying to escape. It was enough to protect bomber formations that were tearing apart German industry. It was enough to convince Luftwaffe pilots that engaging American escorts was increasingly suicidal. And it was achieved not through revolutionary new technology or billion-dollar development programs, but through a sergeant in a maintenance tent who was willing to bend some metal and break some rules because he'd watched too many pilots not come home. The title of this story promised 487 miles per hour over Berlin. That's the mythology, the simplified narrative that sounds dramatic and definitive. The reality is messier. It's 460 miles per hour, achieved by mechanics working 16-hour shifts. Its engines worn out after 250 hours instead of 400. Its field modifications that violated manufacturer specifications but kept pilots alive. It's the difference between what the engineering textbooks said was possible and what desperate, competent people made happen anyway. History remembers the P-51 Mustang as the fighter that won the air war over Europe. That's true. But the aircraft that won that war wasn't quite the aircraft that North American aviation designed or that Packard built. It was a modified version, pushed harder than its designers intended, flown by pilots who trusted that someone had done the math correctly. Michael Harrington had done the math, and then he'd done something more important. He'd been willing to implement it, to take responsibility for the consequences, to put his name on modifications that could have killed people if he'd been wrong. He'd been right, most of the time. The pilots who didn't come home, the ones whose engines failed at bad moments, they paid the price for the times when the math wasn't quite perfect. There's no clean ending to this story because war doesn't provide clean endings. The P-51 seconds kept flying, the engines kept wearing out, the mechanics kept replacing them, and the pilots kept pushing 75 inches of boost whenever they needed that extra margin of speed. And when Germany finally surrendered, when the last bomber mission returned without fighter escort for the first time in years, nobody gave much thought to the fuel chemistry, or the boost pressure, or the connecting rod bearings that made it possible. They just knew they'd survived. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.